Hey everybody, today we're going to be talking about two subjects very important to the development of the West, and that would be the Great Migration to the Southwest Territories during and after the War of 1812, and also the Missouri Compromise, which is critically important when we consider that it would shape the future of the West, and specifically territory carved from the recently acquired Louisiana Purchase. The Great Migration is usually associated with the movement of African Americans from the South to the North before, during, and after World War I. And that was in reaction to, of course, political disfranchisement and desegregation, which was legalized in the South. And so this may surprise you to learn that this is a movement of people, both white and black, to the areas of western Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and even Louisiana. And we might say that the Great Migration really was caused by something of a perfect combination of factors. It's one of the greatest migrations in American history. And there are several reasons why this took place, and they all happened within a few years, and can explain this phenomenon, the movement of thousands of people out of the old South, the old colonial South, the Carolinas, Virginia, and into this new region, which will later be called the Black Belt because of the rich soil of the Mississippi River and the importance of cotton and sugar cane to this region. There was, again, the first factor, that during the War of 1812, Andrew Jackson fought the Creek Indians in the Southwest in the Alabama Territory. And his victory at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend in 1814. And in the aftermath of that, we see a huge treaty that was turned over from Creek lands to the United States. And the PowerPoint here demonstrates that, the Treaty of Fort Jackson in 1814. If you look at this, you can see it's a substantial amount of land, millions of acres, which is opened up for the first time, forcing Indians to move further to the west and be confined to smaller areas of the Alabama Territory. Jackson's people who were with him in the army had seen the potential of this land. One officer said, quote, "The land is capable of producing in great abundance every article necessary to man," unquote. In other words, his topographical engineers that were part of Jackson's army fighting the Creek had been able to sing the praises of this land in the Alabama valleys. So the potential was seen there even before a good number of people were moving. Secondly, after the war, and in large ways we can say even without the treaty with the Creek Indians, squatters, people who had no title to the land, just went ahead and moved to the area. When the army would move forcibly these squatters off the land because clearly they didn't have legal title to it, the folks just moved back to the area anyway. And this happened throughout American history, whether it be the British trying to contain Americans after the French and Indian War, or during the aftermath of other conflicts when the United States tried to actually establish something of a coherent and ordered settlement west. It didn't always work out according to their plans. We might say another factor would be securing more areas of the Floridas from really 1810 with the West Florida Rebellion that I talked about in an earlier lecture. And in the aftermath of the war, when both President Madison and Secretary of State John Quincy Adams attempts to negotiate from the Spanish more of the territory of Florida, more of the Panhandle, and then, of course, the peninsula itself. What this means, access to the Floridas, is that Americans have more ability to trade in the Gulf region. So New Orleans is only the beginning. There'll be, of course, Mobile and ports along the Florida coast, including Pensacola, Gulfport, Biloxi, in the Mississippi Territory. That matters. That matters for people who have to get their products to the West. And access to the rivers and the ability to export what you grow or make will determine whether or not you might move to a new area. So it's a testament to this fast settlement that Mississippi and Alabama become states in 1817 and 1819, respectively. The price for land is also reduced. The great majority of the people moving in this area, both black and white, are from Georgia, Tennessee, the Carolinas, in some cases from Europe. The attraction of inexpensive land and the potential of growing a very promising cash crop that, of course, would be cotton. The innovation of the cotton gin we can throw in as well, a technological advance where the amount of cotton that can be processed just multiplies by a factor. And then, of course, with that is the demand for American cotton from overseas. So all of this being thrown together kind of creates what I would call this perfect storm, this perfect combination of factors. Fewer movements in history had seen or witnessed such a fast settlement. When we're talking about the Alabama population in 1820, a year after it became a state, was 128,000. Mississippi, their population during this same time, about 1820, was 75,000. So easily past the threshold for becoming a state. 75,000, the Mississippi number. This is in spite of the fact that the Choctaw and Chickasaw Indians of the Southwest, several of the five, what they were later to be called civilized nations, actually had title to and controlled 2/3 of the state. So in the 1/3 that was left, it was enough to grant Mississippi statehood. The Great Migration in the Southwest focused on areas around Natchez and the Tennessee River, areas also of northern Alabama in its infancy. Georgia and Carolina residents are shocked at the number of their own people in the old colonial South moving to areas which they would later deem the Black Belt. They traveled on one avenue, the Federal Road, which was built from Columbia in central South Carolina to Columbus, Georgia. And some also called it a fever, the fever pitch settlement of this region. And this map will indicate and show you as the United States is adding territory. Put this whole story together. We have Indiana and Illinois in the 18 teens. So this is happening in the Northwest as well, south of the Great Lakes. Of course, we finished the last discussion with Louisiana becoming a state in 1812. And of course, the other territories of the Southwest, Mississippi, and then later Alabama. So a perfect storm. The third factor, cheap land and a high price for American cotton. The federal government tries to impose some semblance of order and sells land in the Southwest for $2 an acre. And you have to buy a minimum of 160 acres. So you just can't go in and buy 2-3 acres. There is a requirement about how much to buy, and that means you have to come up with a minimum of $320 or so dollars. And if you didn't have that, you could buy the land on credit, which was something new. Banks were giving generous loans based on the promise that this loans credit would be paid back with interest, of course, which is what banks do. 1 million acres of federal land was sold alone in 1815. Important year, the end of course, the War of the 1812. President Monroe later on would want to raise the price of land, but Congress didn't want to do that. They didn't agree with that notion. That might generate more income for the U.S. government, which one of the two main revenue sources for the U.S. government. That would be, of course, land and the tariff, the tax on imports coming from overseas. Why were folks willing to do this? Why were they willing to move into this frontier area? And a lot of it has to do with the attractive high price of cotton. At the end of the Napoleonic Wars, and we may even throw that in as a factor as well, finally, after going on a generation, 25 or so years since the wars of the French Revolution between Great Britain and France ended in 1814 and 1815, it's a resumption of trade on the high seas, peaceful trade, to which the United States didn't have to worry about their ships being captured by either the French or the English. In the aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars and the War of 1812, ending around the same time in 1815, the price in New Orleans markets for cotton doubles. This is what pulls people. Push and pull factors are critical when you're talking about migration. These are the pull factors. Also, you could grow a new variety of cotton. If the soil was decent in the Southwest and you had 200 frost-free days, a farmer could grow the short staple variety of cotton, which was perfect for the uplands of Alabama and Mississippi, and of course North Louisiana as well. In the Southwest, this short staple cotton would more than double the old typical production for an acre of land that you got in the old South, where you had Sea Island cotton, which was a different texture, in some ways a different plant. By 1820, 730,000 bales were being produced in the American South. The same year, 1820, that the United States surpasses India as the world leader as an exporter of cotton. That happens in 1820. Cotton becomes to the U.S. what sugar was to the West Indies or the Caribbean islands in the 18th century. By that I mean the 1700s. It just very much determines everything. Your way of life, labor, slavery, expansion of land, and the necessity of defending this crop and the labor force slavery during the 18 teens and the 1820s. Without cotton, the labor-intensive concentrations of slavery may never have taken place in the Southwest during the early years of the 1800s. Many a planter from the Upper South, so not only individuals hoping to cash in on the crops of sugar and cotton, but people who were established, very wealthy, let's say rice or tobacco planters from Virginia or the Carolinas or Georgia, might cut ties with that region, sell their land, take their slaves, and move to the West. And this migratory pattern, because they were looking to increase their profits in relation to that cash crop. Of course, you need slaves to clear forests, drain swamps, and plant the crops. This great migration is a migration of black and white. Whites either bring slaves along or they purchase them from traders in the area. Congress, meanwhile, the United States Congress, in the years right before the War of 1812, had passed legislation to stop the participation in the international slave trade. That happened in 1808. That was part of the Constitution, which said 20 years after this document is passed, the overseas slave trade will stop as far as the U.S. participating in it and buying slaves from overseas. A lot of people were worried about that, and not surprisingly, purchases of slaves in the Old South increased as there was a genuine concern that there would be a shortage of slaves in the Old South, but that needn't have been a concern for folks because those that were moving to the Southwest often purchased slaves from the older established areas where there was, thanks to natural increase, slave births, again, almost as far as numbers, as prolific as the white population in the Old South, had been the case since the middle of the 1700s. So many slave owners were forced to sell what they would call surplus slaves, too many to work the limited amount of land that they had, and they willingly either up and move to cotton and sugar lands, or they would simply sell slaves that they owned to friends, neighbors, family members who were moving from the upper South to the lower Southwest, to Georgia, to Alabama, and Mississippi. Slave owners saw what was taking place. They saw what they called the coffles, slaves moving, chained together, moving from the upper South to the lower South. They pitied the movement of slaves in this region, but they didn't do anything to stop it. And as this slide indicates, this is a quote of one observer calling the movement of, and we're talking tens of thousands of folks, white and black, moving to the southwest, a wretched cavalcade, marching half-naked women and men loaded with chains without being charged with any crime but that of being black, from one section of the United States to the other, hundreds of miles. The procession would be of usually 12 to 100 slaves, marched by slave dealers, and usually they expected to cover 25 miles a day. Some would be sent passengers and those moving alike by ship, but mostly this movement took place over land. The long trek from a place like Virginia to Mississippi, or Virginia or North Carolina to Louisiana took 6 to 8 weeks, 2 months to move that amount of time. Usually done in winter after the harvest. Slaves were worked, of course, in grueling conditions, and after whatever crop they were dealing with had been harvested. That's when the movement took place. Only later, when Kentucky and Tennessee, again, fairly new states from the 1790s, when those two regions had a surplus of slaves, did the phrase being sold down the river was born in that area, referring to slaves that would be sold and moved along the Ohio River and down the Mississippi River. Sold down the river refers to movement from the upper South to the deep South, and it has a lot to do with the fact that when you're talking about moving to the deep South, it is some of the most brutal slave regimes, especially around the processing and growing of sugarcane from Natchez all the way south through Baton Rouge and New Orleans. Slave traders preferred people in the prime of life, late teens, early 20s, those that could survive the trip, those that would make, for the most part, good field hands, although slaves were taught at a number of different trades, of course, during this time period. The interstate slave trade, as it would be called, is big business. From 1810 to 1820, the Chesapeake region, that would mean Maryland and Virginia, sent 124,000 slaves from that region to the deep South. The westward migration was forced for those who were slaves. Others who were free, it meant, of course, different things, including a chance for wealth. You could raise cotton, get a fresh start, buy cheap land, and your yield, your crop yield, would be successful. Men often made the trip alone. Women did not often look forward to the trip, leaving kinships, family, friends. It's the frontier, a little that we might think of it that way, but certainly you felt isolated moving into very sparsely developed regions of this new part of the United States. Friends back in the Old South, it's like picking up and moving today, only you feel a lot more isolated because there's no way to communicate with some of the modern conveniences that we have today. Slaves, of course, have a similar experience. This is the second, third generation, even longer, of folks who had not had ties to Africa. These are African Americans living in the United States, they have no say or choice. They up and move if they had been living in the Upper South for years, a generation or two. It all depends on the whims of the owner. One historian has called it, I think this is an interesting term, a second Middle Passage. The Middle Passage refers to the movement of slaves from Africa to their first New World destination. This was called a second Middle Passage. Conditions, of course, in this movement worsen in the newly settled areas. It's one thing, too, and the regime of slavery in the Upper South, whether it be growing wheat or corn or a number of different jobs, working as a house servant, working as a cook on a large farmer plantation. People were pulled out of these conditions in the Old South and moved to the Southwest. And the process of establishing and clearing land, we often sometimes we might forget, well, this is tough, clearing trees, digging wells, building houses. This whole process of settlement has to begin all over again. Back-breaking work, clearing land. All that had happened generations ago in the colonial days in Virginia and Maryland and areas of South Carolina around the rice plantations of Charleston. This process now repeats itself when we're talking about movement to the Southwest. The most unfortunate are those slaves sent to sugar plantations in South Louisiana. When the owner or overseer determined that the sugar would have to be processed, it was literally all hands on deck, and that had to be done before the frost. Many a small farmer would often mix cotton growing with the production of corn and growing of hogs, lumber. I don't want you to think that everyone moving to the South was a slave owner. It was a distinct slave owning minority. You would see groups of individuals working simply with the labor of their family, or they might even rent slaves during harvest time from someone who was a slave owner. Those that did grow corn did cut lumber and, of course, sell it to others. This is less profitable, but at the same time, you avoid a lot of the fluctuations of the market. And you can't eat cotton. So you have to develop, and you rely on the small yeoman farmers, as they were called in Jefferson's time, the people that he romanticized as the future who would move to the West. That would be mixed in as well, working small, more modest parcels of land. Not everyone, and just a small percentage. And we often confuse the Old South and the time before the Civil War with these grand mansions and kind of the Gone with the Wind story. That's not really the norm, it's the exception. Cotton becomes a driving force of the transformation of the area, the Southwest and throughout the world. What is happening with this perfect storm idea, if we throw the last factor in, that's overseas demand for cotton coming from English textiles mills, which are in their years of the Industrial Revolution. And it started in the late 1700s. But England getting its cotton from one of its colonies, India, and other parts of the Mediterranean region, now relies more heavily on American cotton. In the post-war years, meaning after the Napoleonic Wars and after the War of 1812 end, 39% of U.S. exports are made up of cotton, meaning nearly 40% of everything that the U.S. sends out of the country is cotton. In 1840, that number goes from 39% to 59%, nearly 60%. Cotton production and slave labor made it all possible, made possible the conditions of industrialization, not only in Europe, but later in the United States. This is a national economy. American cotton also goes to the north. Slave-grown cotton goes to American mills as well. So this is a national development, national institution. But if not for this storm of new land, the cotton gin, short staple cotton, the cotton press, which allows you to take this bulky crop and compress it to make it more easy to move, and the hybridization of cotton from places like Texas and Mexico growing in the American Southwest, all of this factors in to really determine the future of this area. And of course, the forced labor and the movement of slaves to the region. It's a question for the rest of the West, especially that there's another crisis in the aftermath of the War of 1812. Not only financial panic, the Panic of 1819, where the bubble bursts and cotton drops from about 34.5 cents to 24 cents, then to 14 cents. It's the first national depression, the Panic of 1819. And what confounds a lot of people, they didn't use the term recession or depression. Instead, they might use the term hard times or panic, because literally that's what people were doing. They panicked because a lot of what caused the 1819 hard times, which lasted several years, they were helpless to control. Well, I grew cotton, grew corn, and grew grain crops in the north. This was a national panic, by the way. This was a national depression. But it's the first time that the panic was not the result of a war, the war's over, or famine, or successive crop failures, where there's, a cotton blight for multiple years, a drought, which may cause something like that to take place. No, this was just worldwide events that were beyond a lot of people's control. And that's what frustrated folks, especially those who were having their lands foreclosed, because they got credit based on the high cotton prices, and then the bottom fell out, not only in cotton, but in the Northwest. But this was one of several issues that the West had to, of course, and then the story of the West is about the movement to the Southwest territories, to the movement in other regions, especially around the same time of the panic. What we have take place in new regions, especially in Missouri. Missouri enters the national debate beginning in 1819 because it is considering applying for statehood. This map shows Missouri in 1861 with the growth of the counties, but in 1819, enough settlers had crossed the Mississippi River and entered the Missouri Territory so that they could consider statehood and apply to statehood for the Congress. What's interesting about this Missouri crisis, the Missouri debates, and later the Missouri Compromise, it all started when Congress was considering the bill of Missouri statehood. And one congressman, a man from New York, his name was James Talmadge, presented to Congress what they called an enabling act. You authorize Missouri voters to elect a convention, make choices about the Constitution. But Talmadge had something in mind. He's from New York, and it's something of a bombshell about what happens with the Missouri bill. He says, essentially, let's make a requirement of statehood for Missouri. What we'll essentially do is say that further importation of slaves into the Missouri Territory should be stopped. And then children born into slavery, once they reach the age of 25, they will be free. They will be emancipated. And it's an interesting part of development, set of developments. In some ways, he's following what he had known in the state of New York and other states in the East, what we would call today gradual emancipation. Again, it wasn't going to end slavery overnight. It was going to be a slow process because there were thousands of slaves in Missouri in 1819. Missouri was probably unlikely to become a major slaveholding state. But slaves were brought in because of the settlers around Missouri who were from slave states. Basically, the soil was not advantageous for the growing of cotton, and the climate and being too far north, it probably wouldn't become an area for that cash crop, such as Arkansas, later on Texas, and areas of the Southwest. The western lands, and some thought in that area, all right, well, maybe it's not cotton and maybe it'll be other crops. Hemp was considered a very disagreeable plant. It was used to make rope, and it seemed only fit for slave labor. So you couldn't really, some would say, deny the ability of people to take slaves into the region. Unfortunately, a substantial number of slave owners already lived in the area. So what would take place if slaves already lived, thousands of whites and blacks in the territory? How do you undo this settlement? And Talmadge essentially was saying, well, you couldn't. The question of Missouri, maybe it was the land suited for small farming. Chattel slavery was not needed. And he got a number of congressmen and senators on board with this idea. Missouri itself, as far as a lot of people in the East were concerned, was something of an unknown region. People had maybe heard about it, St. Louis, and the fact that it was in Louisiana Territory. All of a sudden, it would be associated, maybe some people thought, with the fur trade, maybe with the French traders and trappers over there. But beyond the river named for the territory, the conventional wisdom is that there might be active volcanoes beyond the Missouri River as it stretched. Again, essence of what Jefferson, Lewis, and Clark, and a lot of people thought about the West before they actually traveled to that area in 1804 to 1806. Plus, it bordered, and this was the unknown. The Missouri crisis was a crisis because it's the first territory carved out of the Louisiana Purchase. And you might be thinking, well, Louisiana became a state, but that had already an established population of French, Spanish, white, and black in 1803. Missouri was sparsely settled in 1803. So out of the entire purchase, this would be the first area that the unknown question, could Congress attach a requirement on this new territory? And Talmadge certainly thought yes. The issue was that Missouri bordered Free Soil, Illinois, but it also bordered slave states, Tennessee, Kentucky, and Congress was unsure how to act. In a democratic West, meaning the idea of moving these small yeoman farmers into this region, could they justify moving slaves into the area and then argue what many slave owners had talked about, this idea of diffusion, that slavery would weaken if it was allowed to extend to new areas? This is something of a strange argument, but it's one that they stood by for a long time, literally thinning the institution of slavery into new area. And since many thought, well, slavery might be weakening because the ability of individuals to purchase slaves overseas had been stopped by Congress. So that would mean that as it moved to the West, there was less of a hold on the institution of slavery to the development of that region. Something of an interesting argument. We know now it's kind of silly because the ability of slave owners to move from areas where it had existed since colonial days to move hundreds of thousands of African Americans to new areas, and then the ability of these slaves to then have children who would be born into slavery, and their children have children. This would be passed on generationally, and it would not thin out. It would not diffuse as those folks were arguing. It would in fact remain, or if not become stronger. Well, this is why this debate took several years and really brought Congress to a halt. James Talmadge had something of a history of this type of behavior with gradual emancipation. This was his track record, in other words. He had objected to Illinois statehood because some people in Illinois, having settled from slave areas, wanted to, in fact, bring slaves into the region. So he was essentially thinking that maybe Missouri could follow the New York plan, help speed up gradual emancipation. This may surprise people when you think about it, but there were probably about 10,000 slaves still in New York, in the North, at the time of Missouri's applying for statehood. And what Talmadge had done was essentially suggested with Missouri follow the New York plan, gradual emancipation. He thought to himself, and other members of Congress agreed with this idea, masters in Missouri had nothing to complain about. It doesn't free any slaves. It's a gradual step. Slaves in Missouri who were over 25 would remain a slave until their death, unless they were freed by their owner. Those slaves, however, born after Missouri statehood, would become free at 25. So there is at least a generation of adjustment. It doesn't free any slaves. Unfortunately, it opens up a storm of protests, the very idea of limiting slavery in the West. Northern congressmen invoke morality, meaning there's something wrong with slavery. Religion, of course, arguing against slavery, and the Declaration of Independence. What we're seeing in Congress is a debate that no one wants to have, justifying slavery, defending slavery, or attacking it, which, as we know, this is the so-called era of good feelings, with James Monroe as president, and President Monroe, as a slave owner, is the last issue he would like to deal with and distract him from other issues, including the panic and the economic hard times beginning in 1819. So, the South presents a solid and implacable position about this idea of attacking slavery. Could Congress, the question is, limit slavery from moving into the new territories? That's the big question. The North and South, Northern congressmen and senators, Southern congressmen and senators, begin to form arguments that they will use for the next 40 years until the eve of the American Civil War. They will attack and defend each other based on many of the debates that take place here. The morality of slavery is argued, and it was the first time it was probably argued since going back to the Constitutional Convention. And it's a debate that not a lot of people want to have. Thomas Cobb of Georgia says in a speech, quote, "You have kindled a fire which all the waters of the ocean cannot put out, which seas of blood can only extinguish," unquote. It's the overture to an opera drama about slavery. People are hearing the words Civil War and disunion spoken in the halls of Congress. The Missouri debate revealed that the South was not less attached, but more attached to the institution of slavery since the American Revolution. This is, in some ways, a shock to many in the North because slavery had been outlawed in the New England states, put on a path to gradual emancipation in the old middle colonies, New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. Slave property had, and the value soared thanks to the opening of the Southwest, the domestic slave trade, and cotton. Slave prices for field hands remained very high, worth between $400 to $500 in 1814. And I wish I could give you a modern, because everyone asks, I mean, what does that mean in 2010 or $14? There is no good way to kind of convert that, but because I've heard everything from $15,000 to $30,000 in modern money to give you an equivalent. But we'll stick to the numbers in 1814. A slave deemed a field hand worth from $400 to $500 in 1814 would be worth $800 to $1,100 by 1819. This is a reflection of all of that storm of factors I talked about. The opening up of creek lands, the cotton gin, and the Great Migration to the Southwest. This $800 to $1,100 number may go even higher, based on, among other things, the value of land and the price of cotton. If slavery stopped at the Mississippi River, the Upper South, the rationale was, couldn't trade in slaves, specifically children, or sell the children of slaves to others moving to the West. Not that Missouri was going to develop into prime tobacco or cotton land. That didn't matter. It was the principle. Could Congress put a limit on the people's ability to move their property, which is what they legally define slaves as property, into new territories? Here's the idea. It's said another way. If it stops in Missouri, if Talmadge's idea was accepted and tied to Missouri statehood, in other words, Congress wouldn't pass Missouri's plan to become a state unless it did put slavery on a gradual path to emancipation. No doubt people in the South said other new territories would follow Missouri's path, not allowing slavery. That was one of the questions. And in one respect, the Missouri debates really talked about power in Congress. Slavery, Southerners were beginning to say, was a positive good. In other words, they weren't saying arguments that they raised at the Constitutional Convention. It's a necessary evil. We were stuck with this institution. Our parents and grandparents brought it over. Now they were arguing the benefits of slavery to not only slaves, believe it or not, shock our modern ears, but to whites as well. The Missouri controversy was also about power, also about representation and power in Congress. Many whites were, in the North, indifferent to the plight of slaves. In other words, slavery is an institution down there. We're more concerned, many in the Northern congressmen and senators, about the fact that the South already is overrepresented in Congress. If you remember about the Constitutional Convention, Southern states get to count 3/5 of slaves as part of their population. Your population number goes to the number of the members of House of Representatives that you send to Congress. And so that was a bitter pill that Northerners had to swallow. It was a compromise on slavery itself back in 1787. And so, from the Northern point of view, adding another slave state wasn't about the fact that slavery was wrong. Not everyone was making the moral arguments. It was about a question of fairness. Well, Southerners were saying it was about fairness too. In 1819, there are an equal number of slave and free states. Unfortunately, the South looked at the population and said, in the North, more people live in the North. So we are on and are part of a distinct minority in the House of Representatives, even with our 3/5 compromise. There are more Northern or free state congressmen than slave state congressmen. If Missouri is added as a free state, not only will they have more representation in the House, but they will get 2 more free state senators. Now, with the same number of slave and free states, the representation is the same. 11 free, 11 slave. That's 22 senators from northern states and southern states. If Missouri is added with Talmadge's amendment and made a free state, it will give the North a majority, which already exists in the House, but now a majority in the Senate. And then, because people will accept the Missouri plan as the rest of the development of the West, the new territories will also be free states, putting the South forever in a minority status. And that's the other question, not only about indicting the system of slavery, but also the question of power. Now, when this debate enters its second year, going into 1820, there was a fortunate development in that the territory of Maine, which had been traditionally part of Massachusetts going back to the colonial period, also applied for statehood. And that opened up the potential for a compromise to take place, engineered by Henry Clay, the Speaker of the House. Maine would join as a free state to keep the free and slave state balance, and Missouri would join as a slave state. So Talmadge's ideas were rejected. Missouri, with about 10,000 slaves in its population in 1820, would become a slave state. Maine would join as a free state, keeping the balance even. That's one of the compromises that took place. What about the future of the Missouri Territory? Well, that was a compromised issue and solved by Congress on a line across the southern border of Missouri. This is the fabled 3630 line, the southern border of Missouri, all the way to the end of the Louisiana Territory. Now, let's keep in mind that there are regions of the North American continent that are not in possession of the United States, which would include areas of New Spain, soon to be Mexico, and their northern provinces called Tejas, and the Oregon country, occupied by both the United States and Great Britain, jointly occupied. So a good portion of the West, or the American United States West, ends roughly at the Rocky Mountains, and a border which will be established between the nation of Spain and John Quincy Adams. You can see this on this slide. It's kind of that stepladder divide in 1819. So the line all the way across Missouri. To the north, slavery is banned. To the south, it will be allowed. Not everyone and most people are not happy with this. Southerners say, well, the North got its way and they were able to contain slavery below what they call the 3630 line. Well, everyone from folks in the North and South in Congress and even Thomas Jefferson say, look, when I heard about former President Jefferson, retired, says, look, I really think that the Missouri crisis is like a fire bell in the night. He will later go on to say about the institution of slavery, and he is a substantial slave owner, it's as if we have the wolf by the ears. We cannot let go, and hanging on at the same time is just as dangerous. The wolf by the ears. Kind of an effective statement about this at least temporary compromise, which Congress was able to work out in 1820 and 1821. Nevertheless, it showed that the development of the Louisiana Territory and the rest of the West was fraught with problems. The Missouri Compromise line will hold up for 34 years. It becomes a time-honored tradition of congressional compromise, but it leaves open the potential that the rest of the West, there will be more political debates. The idea of diffusion, or moving slavery into new areas and then having it weaken, are basically exploded by, again, not only the interstate trade, slave trade, but of course by the fact that slavery strengthens in the Old South and the new Southwest based on the cotton crop. I gave you the numbers about how cotton becomes one of the predominant Southern crops. Southerners defending it, and those that attack slavery will come back and saying, you dare not attack cotton. Cotton is king. That's a very important statement, and it really sums up the South's attitude about their region, about their economy, and about kind of a bunker mentality they have about the institution of slavery.